Southern Gaul, the summer of 102 BCE, a migrating nation called the Teutones is moving toward Italy, a column of warriors, wagons, and families so long that ancient writers claimed it took 6 days simply to pass a single fixed point. Their confidence is absolute and it is earned. 3 years earlier, at a river crossing called Arausio, these people and their allies annihilated the largest army the Roman Republic had ever assembled. The Roman force shadowing them now does not offer battle. It marches. Day after day it keeps pace with the horde, every man moving under a load that modern estimates puts somewhere between 60 and 100 pounds, and every single evening, without exception, it halts early and builds a fortress from nothing. The Teutones ride close enough to laugh at them. According to the ancient accounts, they shouted up at the ramparts asking whether the legionaries had any messages they could carry to their wives in Rome, since they would arrive there first. Within weeks, the people who shouted that joke would no longer exist as a nation, and the battle that ended them was not won on the battlefield. It was won on the road in the weeks before by men their enemies mistook for pack animals. That mistake was understandable. The Romans made it themselves. They called these soldiers muli Mariani, the Mules of Marius. So the question this video answers is a simple one that becomes stranger the longer you look at it. How does a man carry the weight of a loaded modern rucksack, cover a distance most of us would hesitate to walk empty-handed, dig a fortified camp before dinner, and then do it again the next day, and the day after that, for an entire campaign season? The answer is not toughness. Toughness does not scale to 100,000 men. The answer is engineering, applied to the human body itself. And one of the most important objects in that soldier's pack was not a weapon at all. Here is what we are going to take apart over the next 25 minutes. First, the pack itself, item by item, including the tool one Roman commander reportedly valued above the sword. Second, what that load actually does to a human body, drawing on modern biomechanics research conducted on soldiers, including one study whose finding is genuinely unsettling because it shows the pack attacking the single muscle group a marching man can least afford to tire. Third, the marching camp, the temporary fortress the legion raised every evening and abandoned every morning, and what excavations in Scotland and Hungary reveal about the system behind it. Fourth, the arithmetic of the Roman road, how engineers converted geography into numbers a general could plan a war around, and how permanent fortresses in Britain functioned as the stock shelves of that system. And fifth, the reform at the center of it all, how a 7-time consul named Gaius Marius deleted the slowest component of the Roman army and the one piece of the old system he quietly kept, because without it, the entire machine seized up. A note on method before we begin. This episode is built from excavation reports, from load carriage research on modern soldiers, and from the standard reference works on the Roman army, where the ancient sources exaggerate, and they exaggerate constantly, I will tell you. To understand the reform, you have to understand the catastrophe that made it possible. In 105 BCE, Rome sent 2 armies north to stop the migrating tribes at Arausio, on the Rhone, near the modern French town of Orange. The 2 commanders could hardly have been chosen worse. Quintus Servilius Caepio was a proconsul from one of the oldest patrician families in Rome, and Gnaeus Mallius Maximus was a consul, technically Caepio's superior, but a new man, the first of his family ever to hold high office. Caepio regarded taking orders from such a man as beneath him, and the 2 despised each other so completely that they camped separately, on opposite banks at first and then dangerously close but still uncoordinated, and refused to cooperate even as the tribal host bore down on them. The tribes destroyed them one at a time, Caepio's army first, then Mallius's, with the Rhone at the Roman backs cutting off retreat. Ancient sources claim 80,000 Roman soldiers died in that single day, some adding tens of thousands of camp followers on top. The figure is almost certainly inflated, ancient casualty numbers usually are, but even the most cautious modern reading leaves it among the worst military disasters in Roman history, comparable to or worse than Cannae, the massacre by Hannibal a century earlier, that Romans used as their benchmark for catastrophe. The panic in the city was real enough that the sources speak of a terror with its own name, the terror Cymbricus, and of emergency measures to hold the state together. And the loss cut deeper than grief, because Rome now faced a shortage not of money or equipment, but of eligible men. The traditional Roman army recruited property owners, farmers who supplied their own gear and expected to go home for the harvest, and the census classes that qualified had been shrinking for decades as small farms failed and their families drifted landless into the city. Arausio drained what remained of that pool in an afternoon. Into this emergency stepped Gaius Marius, a soldier from Arpinum, a hill town southeast of Rome, a man from outside the old aristocracy who had learned war the hard way, serving as a young officer at the siege of Numancia in Spain under Scipio Aemilianus, and who had just brought the long, embarrassing war against King Jugurtha in North Africa to a successful close. He would eventually hold the consulship 7 times, a record unmatched in the Republic's history, and in the year after Arausio, the Roman people, ignoring law and custom, elected him in absentia because he was the only commander they still trusted. Marius did the thing the crisis demanded and the aristocracy dreaded. He opened the legions to the Capite censi, the head count, the men counted in the census by their heads alone because they owned nothing worth recording. Volunteers with nothing were handed standardized equipment by the state, promised pay and land, and drilled into a professional force. But it is the second, less famous part of the reform tradition that concerns us tonight. Marius looked at the Roman army on the move and identified its slowest, most vulnerable, most expensive component, the baggage train. Miles of carts, oxen, mules, and camp servants crawling behind the fighting men, dictating their route, their speed, and their fate. His solution was brutal in its simplicity. Take the load off the wagons and strap it to the soldier. The men, with the black humor of infantry in every century, named themselves accordingly. Marius's mules. It sounds like cruelty. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic is worth seeing up close, because it is the arithmetic of every army since. Consider what a baggage train actually costs. The Romans had a word for it, impedimenta, and the word tells you everything, because it literally means the hindrances. Brill's New Pauli, the standard encyclopedia of the classical world, described the train as the mass of animals, vehicles, and equipment trailing an army, and the operational problem is obvious the moment you picture it. An ox walks at roughly 2 miles per hour and can work perhaps 5 hours a day before it must graze, which means a column of ox carts moves at the speed of the slowest ox and stops when the oxen stop. It cannot leave a road, it cannot climb a ridgeline or ford a rough stream. It must be guarded along its entire length, which means fighting men are subtracted from the line to babysit luggage, and an enemy who cannot beat your legions can still ruin your campaign by burning your carts. Every mile of wagons is a mile of vulnerability, and armies of this era could trail wagon columns stretching farther than the fighting column itself. Now run Marius's exchange. Move the essential load onto the soldier's back, and 3 things happen at once. The column contracts. The army's speed becomes the speed of a conditioned man's legs, not an animal's, and the route becomes a choice rather than a constraint. So what, exactly, did the soldier carry? On his body, the armor, a mail shirt of interlinked iron rings weighing somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 pounds, a bronze or iron helmet at around 4, a sword, a dagger, and the heavy javelins called pila, each around 4 to 5 pounds of wood and iron, with a shield slung or carried, the big curved scutum adding perhaps another 15 to 20 pounds. Over his shoulder went a pole, the furca, and lashed to it the sarcina, the marching bundle, rations for multiple days, typically grain, around 1.5 kilograms or so of wheat and other foodstuffs per day, plus the twice-baked hard biscuit called buxulatum that kept nearly forever, a bronze mess kit and cooking pot, a canteen, spare clothing, and a cloak that doubled as a blanket. Then the part people forget. The tools, a saw, a basket for moving earth, a turf cutter, sharpened wooden stakes for the camp palisade, and the dolabra, a combined pickaxe and axe, the tool that the general Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, according to the military writer Frontinus, said won wars, his line being that the enemy is beaten with the dolabra, meaning that the army that digs, builds, and fortifies has already won before the swords come out. Add it together and you arrive at those modern estimates, 60 pounds at the merciful end, close to 100 at the other. The historian Josephus, watching Roman legions operate in Judea a century and a half later, wrote that their drills were bloodless battles and their battles bloody drills, and that the men marched as if they had been born with their equipment attached. Under that load, Roman training standards, as the late military manual of Vegetius records them, expected roughly 20 Roman miles covered in 5 summer hours at the regular step, and 24 at the full step, a Roman mile running just under a modern one, 1,000 paces of 5 Roman feet each, which is where the word mile comes from in the first place. This is what the Teutones were watching from horseback in 102 BCE, not men marching, a logistic system with a heartbeat. Now let us do what the Romans could not, and put that soldier in a laboratory. Because here is the remarkable thing. Modern militaries load their infantry to almost exactly the same weights. American soldiers in Afghanistan routinely carried approach loads in the same 60 to 100-pound band, and modern scientists have spent decades measuring what happens next. Start with fuel. A 1978 study in the journal Ergonomics measured the energy expenditure of heavy load carriage directly, part of a research tradition that produced predictive equations still used by armies today. And the plain finding underneath all such work is that the cost of moving climbs steeply, not linearly with the weight on your back, and climbs again with speed and with gradient, meaning a loaded march is not a walk, it is sustained labor with the caloric appetite of labor. A soldier doing this daily can burn 4,000 to 6,000 calories, roughly double a sedentary man's needs, and a legionary covering 20 Roman miles under full load was burning through energy at a rate that made his ration and the grain supply behind it a weapon system in its own right. His roughly 3,000 calories of daily wheat was not generosity. It was the fuel line of the machine. Feed the man or lose the army. Next, the structure. A 2007 study in the journal Military Medicine examined soldiers during constant speed simulated road marching under heavy load, documenting the physiological strain of exactly the task the Legion performed daily, and a 2025 study in the multidisciplinary biomechanics journal went further, reconstructing the kinematics of the spine itself under soldier load carriage. The spine under a pack does not simply stand taller and press on, it reorganizes. The trunk pitches forward to keep the combined center of mass over the feet. The curves of the back flatten and reshape, and the small stabilizing muscles along the lumbar spine take up a constant, grinding, postural workload they were never sized for, and that reorganization has a price paid in the lower back, which is precisely why the Roman furca is such a quietly clever object, a topic we will return to. Then, the erosion. A 2011 study in the Journal of Biomechanics showed that load carriage combined with fatigue measurably alters gait. The way a person walks changes as the miles accumulate under weight, stride mechanics shift, variability creeps in, the precise placement of each footfall gets sloppier, and a 2021 analysis in the International Journal of Biomedical Engineering and Technology tracked neuromuscular fatigue in soldiers across load carriage trials, mapping how the muscle's performance degrades through the task. A tired, loaded man does not merely slow down. He walks differently, less efficiently, less stably, and on ground where a turned ankle can be a death sentence because an army that must leave its lame behind or slow to their pace has been wounded without a single arrow. That sloppiness is itself a casualty mechanism. And then there is the finding I flagged at the start. A 2014 study in the European Journal of Applied Physiology demonstrated that thoracic load carriage, weight strapped around the torso, induces fatigue in the respiratory muscles themselves. Sit with that for a moment. The pack does not only burden the legs and the spine. The mass around the chest loads every single breath, tens of thousands of breaths a day, and tires the diaphragm and the muscles between the ribs, the very muscles that breathe. Worse, respiratory physiology research pioneered by Jerome Dempsey's laboratory at the University of Wisconsin has shown what happens downstream, that when the breathing muscles fatigue, the body defends them by constricting blood vessels in the limbs, stealing blood flow from the legs to protect the diaphragm. The engine and the air intake are being taxed by the same load, and when the intake struggles, the body throttles the engine to save it. This is why every serious army in history has discovered, usually the hard way, that load carriage is not a packing question. It is a physiological budget, and every pound is a withdrawal. Which brings us to the evening, because the Roman answer to that physiological budget was not rest whenever convenient. It was a fortress every single night. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, describes the system in detail, and the routine went like this. Hours before dark, surveyors ride ahead and stake out a rectangle on chosen ground, marking the commander's tent, the 2 main crossing streets, the gates, the unit lines, every position flagged with colored markers so that an arriving army reads its camp like a city it has always lived in. The legion arrives, and instead of collapsing, every man takes up the tools he has carried all day. The baskets move earth, the turf cutters slice sod, the dolabers bite into soil. A ditch goes in around the perimeter, on temporary camps commonly around 5 feet wide and 3 deep. The spoil is piled inward into a rampart, and along its top go the sharpened stakes drawn from thousands of individual packs, each man contributing his pieces of a communal wall. The gates are protected by detached screens of ditch and bank. The arrangements archaeologists call tituli, forcing anyone entering to turn and expose a flank. Inside, a deliberate open strip, the intervallum around 200 feet deep in Polybius' account, separates the tents from the rampart, wide enough that enemy javelins and fire arrows lobbed over the wall fall on empty ground, and wide enough to assemble the army in the dark without chaos. The tent lines follow the same standardized plan as yesterday's camp and last month's, so that any soldier in any legion could wake in darkness and know exactly where the gates, the standards, and his own unit stood. Even Rome's enemies noticed. Plutarch records that King Pyrrhus, seeing a Roman camp generations earlier, remarked that the discipline of these barbarians was nothing barbarian at all. Working in trained teams, a legion could raise the whole thing in around 2 to 3 hours. This is not legend. The archaeology is there in the ground. A 2019 excavation report in the journal Britannia documents a Roman marching camp at Ayr in Scotland, the ditch line of one of these overnight fortresses still legible in the soil roughly 2,000 years later, hard evidence of the system operating at the empire's far edge, and Scotland alone holds the traces of hundreds of such camps, some large enough to have held tens of thousands of men for a single night. And when a camp position mattered enough to keep, the temporary hardened into the permanent. A 2007 study of the Ulcitia Castra military camp at Szentendrei in Hungary examined the walls, the building materials, and the successive construction periods of such a fort on the Danube frontier. The marching camp's logic translated into stone and rebuilt across generations, the same rectangular plan, the same gates, the same streets. Understand what the nightly camp bought. Security, obviously. No Roman army could be rushed in its sleep the way careless armies throughout history have been. But look at it through the biomechanics we just discussed and you see the deeper function. If daily load carriage is accumulating fatigue, degrading gait, taxing the spine and the breathing muscles, then the one thing that makes the system repeatable is controlled, protected, predictable recovery, hot food, guaranteed sleep behind a wall, with sentry duty rotated on a fixed roster so no man lost his rest to chance. The camp was not a comfort. The camp was the recovery phase of an engineered work cycle, as essential to the 20 miles as the boots. And the third pillar of the system was under their feet. The Roman road exists so that distance can become arithmetic. The project began early, the Via Appia driven south from Rome in 312 by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, explicitly as a military artery, and by the imperial period, the network ran to somewhere in the region of 50,000 miles of paved highway. A 2002 study of time and distance in the roads of Roman Italy examines exactly this, how the road network rendered travel into plannable quantities, and that is the point people miss when they admire Roman paving stones. The stones are not the achievement, the predictability is. A firm, drained, cambered surface, raised on an embankment, marked every 1,000 paces by a milestone, catalogued and written itineraries like the later Antonine itinerary that listed routes and distances station by station, means a general in a planning tent can say, the army is 11 days from that river, and be right, which means rations, replacements, and reinforcements can be scheduled the way a modern railway is scheduled. Now add the depots. The marching legion carried days of food, not months, and that only works if the destination is stocked. This is what the great permanent fortresses were, alongside everything else, the warehouses of the system, their raised, ventilated granaries built to hold a year's supply of grain and more. The 2025 excavation report from the Roman legionary fortress at Caerleon in Wales. The 50-acre base the Romans called Isca, home of the 2nd Augustan Legion for 2 centuries, documents a legionary store building in the Priory Field with the equipment and supplies of a fortress that functioned as a fixed node of military capacity, and a 2024 study of Exeter examines that city's origin as a legionary fortress of the mid-1st century CE. Its military structures, including a bathhouse of astonishing sophistication for the edge of the known world, anchoring the network in another corner of Britain, roads to make distance predictable, fortresses to make supply local. soldiers engineered to move between them at pace. That is the machine, and no enemy Rome faced in this era possessed anything like it. So let us name the 5 design decisions that made a mule out of a man, because each one is deliberate. Decision 1, the furca. The load was not strapped across the shoulders like a modern rucksack. The bundle rode on a pole carried over the shoulder, riding high near the line of the spine, and this bought 2 things. It shifted how the weight bore on the body, sparing the chest the very strapping that the respiratory research shows is so costly, and far more importantly, it could be dropped in seconds. A modern soldier shrugging out of a harnessed pack under attack loses precious moments. An attacked legion did not fight in its luggage. The poles went down, the line formed, and the army stood unencumbered while its enemy, if it had baggage of its own, did not have that option. Decision 2, the boots. The caligae were open-work marching boots with heavy soles studded with dozens of iron hobnails, traction and durability engineered for exactly this task, and when nails wore down on those hard road surfaces, you replaced nails, not boots. The writing tablets excavated at Vindolanda on the northern British frontier even record soldiers being sent socks and underwear from home because the boot was an open design worn in every climate. Cheap, repairable, standardized. The Roman logistics philosophy expressed at the scale of a footstep. Decision 3, the cadence. The regular step and the full step were defined. Train standards, distance per hour specified, and the entire legion drilled to them, because a column that moves at one known speed is a column whose arrival can be promised, and the road's arithmetic only works if the men on it are as predictable as the milestones. Decision 4, the training progression. Vegetius records that recruits were required to march those 20 miles in 5 hours before anything else was taught, then hardened under loads of 60 Roman pounds, drilled at swimming, at jumping, at carrying, and entrenching until the campaign day was routine rather than crisis, which, in the language of that modern fatigue research, means the adaptation was built in the safe environment and spent in the dangerous one. Every gait change, every wobble the laboratories measured in untrained subjects, the legion trained out in advance. And decision 5, the rhythm. March, build, eat, sleep, demolish, march. The camp every night, the depot at the end of the line, the road underneath. Not one heroic effort, but a cycle, repeatable for months. And it is the repeatability, not the speed, that broke Rome's enemies. Because a horde can outsprint a legion for a week, nothing in the ancient world could outlast one. Now, the detail from the promised list, the part of the old system Marius kept, because it is the tell that this reform was engineering rather than machismo. The mules never actually left. The reference literature on the Roman baggage train is clear that pack animals remained with the army, allocated down at the small unit level. In the developed system, roughly 1 mule to each contubernium, the 8-man tent group, carrying what no reform could reasonably put on a man's back, the heavy leather tent that slept the 8, the hand mill for grinding the grain ration, the bulk stores and entrenching gear beyond the personal kit. Marius did not abolish the train. He compressed it, cut the ratio of animals and wagons to fighting men so drastically that the army's speed and shape transformed, while keeping exactly the residue of transport the system genuinely required. That is what real optimization looks like, not zero, but the minimum, and the system had a limit, which honest analysis has to state. Everything we saw in the laboratory, the energy cost, the altered gait, the tiring spine, the fatiguing breathing muscles, was still true for the legionary. The load was a mortgage on his body, and a commander who marched his men hard and then threw them straight into battle was asking them to fight while already partially spent. The great Roman commanders understood this in their bones, which is why the best of them treated the final approach to battle with such care, resting the army, choosing the day, choosing the ground. Which returns us, finally, to southern Gaul. 102. Marius, commanding the army the Teutones mocked, refused battle for days while the horde flowed past his ramparts, and Plutarch tells us why, that he wanted his new soldiers, many of whom had never seen these enormous northerners, to watch them from behind a safe wall until the fear wore off and turned to appetite. Then he followed, his men fresh behind their nightly walls while the migration strained against its own enormous logistical mass. Near Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence. He chose his ground, high ground, and even the camp's one flaw became a weapon, because the position was short of water, and when his soldiers complained of thirst, Marius pointed at the river below, near the enemy camp, and told them that there was drink to be had there for the price of blood. A skirmish over that water escalated into the destruction of the Ambrones, the Teutones' allied people, and days later came the main battle. The Teutones' warriors attacked uphill in the heat, into legionaries who had slept behind walls and eaten from a scheduled supply line, while a detached Roman force of around 3,000 men under Claudius Marcellus, positioned in wooded ground behind them exactly as planned, struck the rear at the decisive moment. The line collapsed. King Teutones, whom the sources describe as a giant who could vault over teams of horses, was taken. The ancient sources claim 100,000 killed or captured, inflated, almost certainly like Arausio's numbers. What is not inflated is the outcome. The Teutones, as a fighting people, ended that day, and the following summer, at Vercellae in northern Italy, their allies, the Cimbri, met the same machine and the same result. The men who had asked for messages to carry to Roman wives never crossed into Italy, and the instrument of their destruction was not a secret weapon or a stroke of luck. It was a soldier with 60 to 100 pounds on a pole over his shoulder, 20 Roman miles behind him, a fortress around his bed, and a road under his boots that told his general to the day when he would arrive. Empires like to remember their battles. The battles were the receipts. The purchase happened earlier, on the road, one measured step at a time, made by men who joked that their general had turned them into mules and who were, in the end, the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world ever produced. If this kind of story is why you are here, the mechanisms underneath the famous victories, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there is a new campaign on this channel every week, and a like genuinely helps these longer episodes find the people who want them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next battlefield.